Welcome, and thanks for joining me. I invite you to close your eyes and let your mind drift. Imagine a world where time is not a straight line, but a vast, shimmering tapestry. A tapestry woven with threads of past, present, and future. Tonight, we journey into that world, a world of endless possibilities and infinite wonder. You are the apprentice to a brilliant but eccentric time traveler, a man who has unlocked the secret of the ages. Together, you have explored the farthest reaches of history and glimpsed the distant horizons of the future. But tonight, you embark on a journey unlike any other, a journey that will test your courage, your ingenuity, and your very understanding of time itself. As you drift into this story, let the rhythm of the words carry you away. Feel the hum of the time machine, the whisper of ancient winds, and the pulse of distant stars. This is a tale of discovery, of resilience, and of the unbreakable bond between mentor and apprentice. So relax, breathe deeply, and allow yourself to be swept into the timeless embrace of the time traveler's apprentice. Chapter 1: The Workshop. The workshop was a place of chaos and wonder. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with strange artifacts from across time. A Roman gladius next to a futuristic holograph device. A medieval hourglass beside a clock that ticked backward. The air smelled of oil, metal, and something faintly electric, like the scent of a storm about to break. In the center of the room stood the time machine, a towering contraption of gears, wires, and glowing crystals. It hummed softly, as if alive. Your mentor, Professor Arlick Thorne, bustled around the machine, adjusting dials and muttering to himself. He was a tall, wiry man with wild gray hair and a pair of goggles perpetually perched on his forehead. His coat, a patchwork of fabrics from different eras, swished as he moved. "Ah, there you are," he exclaimed, spotting you in the doorway. Come in. We haven't a moment to lose." You stepped inside, your heart racing with excitement. Tonight was the night. After months of studying, observing, and fetching tea, you were finally being sent on your first solo mission. "Now," the professor said, clapping his hands together, "your task is simple. Observe, but do not interfere. You'll be visiting the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. A pivotal moment in history, my dear apprentice, pivotal." He handed you a small device, a temporal anchor. It looked like a pocket watch, but instead of numbers, its face was covered in swirling symbols. "This will keep you tethered to the correct timeline. If anything goes wrong, it won't, of course, just press the button and it will bring you back." You nodded, clutching the device tightly. The professor led you to the time machine and gestured for you to step inside. The interior was surprisingly cozy, with a plush seat and a control panel covered in glowing buttons. "Remember," he said, leading in, "observe, but do not interfere. The past is a fragile thing. One wrong move, and you could unravel the very fabric of history." You swallowed hard and nodded again. The professor grinned and stepped back, pulling a lever. The machine hummed louder, the crystals glowing brighter. The air around you seemed to shimmer, and then, with a soft whoosh, you were gone. Chapter 2. The Mishap. The first thing you noticed was the smell. It was earthy and damp, with a faint hint of wood smoke. You opened your eyes and found yourself standing in a field. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle fell around you. In the distance, you could see a castle rising above the trees, its stone walls dark and imposing against the gray sky. You checked the temporal anchor. It showed the correct date, June 15th, 12:15. You were in the right place. Relieved, you started toward the castle, careful to stay out of sight. The last thing you needed was to be mistaken for a spy, or worse, a witch. The professor had warned you about the dangers of drawing attention to yourself in the past. Observe, but do not interfere, he said. The past is a fragile thing. But as you walked, something felt off. The air seemed to buzz faintly, like the hum of a distant beehive, and the ground beneath your feet felt unstable, as if it might dissolve at any moment. You glanced at the temporal anchor and gasped. The symbols on its face were spinning wildly, and the device was growing warm in your hand. No, 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 you muttered, pressing the button to return to the present. But nothing happened. The device grew hotter, and the buzzing in the air intensified. You broke into a run, desperate to get away from whatever was happening. The castle loomed ahead, but you didn't dare go any closer. Instead, you veered off the path and into the woods, hoping to find shelter. The trees were dense, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The ground was soft and wet, and your boots sank into the mud with each step. The buzzing grew louder, and the air around you seemed to shimmer, like heat rising off a summer road. You clutched the temporal anchor tightly, willing it to work. And then, with a blinding flash of light, you were gone again. When you opened your eyes, you were no longer in the woods. You were standing in a bustling marketplace, surrounded by people in tunics and sandals. The air was filled with the sounds of haggling merchants, clanging metal, and the occasional bray of a donkey. The smells of spices, roasting meat, and unwashed bodies assaulted your nose. You checked the temporal anchor. The symbols had stopped spinning, but they now showed a date you didn't recognize. You were no longer in 12:15. Panic surged through you, but you forced yourself to stay calm. The professor had taught you that time travel could be unpredictable. You needed to figure out where and when you were. You approached a merchant selling pottery and asked, "Excuse me, what year is it?" The man gave you a strange look, but replied, "Why, it's 79 AD, of course." Your heart sank. You were in ancient Rome, nearly 1,000 years before your intended destination. The temporal anchor was still warm, its symbols flickering faintly. You needed to find a way to fix it, or at least stabilize it, before you could attempt to return to the present. As you wandered through the marketplace, you noticed a man in a toga watching you. He had a kind face and an air of quiet authority. He approached you and said, "You seem lost, traveler. Can I help you?" You hesitated, then nodded. "I'm not from around here. I need to find someone who understands unusual devices." The man smiled. "You're in luck. I know just the person. Follow me." He led you through the narrow streets to a small workshop. Inside was an elderly man who was bent over a table, tinkering with a complex-looking device. He looked up as you entered, his eyes sharp and curious. "This is Lucius," your guide said. "He is the finest engineer in Pompeii." You showed Lucius the temporal anchor and explained, as best you could, what it was supposed to do. He examined it carefully, his fingers moving deftly over the surface. "Fascinating," he murmured. "This is unlike anything I've ever seen. But I think I can stabilize it, at least temporarily." He worked for what felt like hours, adjusting tiny gears and replacing a cracked crystal. Finally, he handed the device back to you. "It should hold for now," he said, "but you'll need to find a more permanent solution." You thanked him and stepped outside. The air was warm, and the sun was beginning to set. You pressed the button on the temporal anchor, hoping it would take you closer to the present. With a flash of light, you were gone again. Chapter 3. The Second Stop. This time, you found yourself in a dense forest. The air was cool and crisp, and the ground was covered in a thick carpet of leaves. Birds chirped in the trees, and a gentle breeze rustled the branches. You took a deep breath, savoring the fresh, earthy scent of the woods. It was a stark contrast to the bustling marketplace of ancient Rome. You checked the temporal anchor. The date now showed 1492. You were in the Renaissance, but you had no idea where. As you walked, you heard the sound of voices and followed them to a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a group of people gathered around a large wooden contraption. It looked like a flying machine, with wings made of cloth and a complex system of pulleys and levers. A man with a long beard and a flowing robe was explaining how it worked. You realized with a start that you were looking at Leonardo da Vinci. He was demonstrating one of his famous inventions. You watched in awe as he and his assistants prepared to test the machine. But as they worked, you noticed something strange. The temporal anchor was growing warm again, its symbols flickering. You needed to leave before it malfunctioned completely. You pressed the button, and with another flash of light, you were gone. When you opened your eyes, you were no longer in the forest. You were standing in a bustling city square, surrounded by people in elaborate Renaissance clothing. The air was filled with sounds of laughter, music, and the clatter of horse-drawn carriages. The buildings around you were grand and ornate, their facades adorned with intricate carvings and frescoes. You checked the temporal anchor. The symbols were spinning wildly again, and the device was growing hotter by the second. You needed to find a way to stabilize it. But where could you go? You didn't know anyone in this time period, and you couldn't risk drawing attention to yourself. As you wandered through the square, you noticed a sign above a doorway. Workshop of Leonardo da Vinci. Your heart leapt. If anyone could help you, it was him. You entered the workshop and found yourself in a room filled with sketches, models, and half-finished inventions. Leonardo himself was bent over a table, sketching furiously. He looked up as you entered, his eyes sharp and curious. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice warm and inviting. You hesitated, then nodded. "I'm not from around here. I need to find someone who understands unusual devices." Leonardo smiled. "You've come to the right place. Show me what you have." You handed him the temporal anchor and explained, as best you could, what it was supposed to do. He examined it carefully, his fingers moving deftly over its surface. "Fascinating," he murmured. "This is unlike anything I've ever seen. But I think I can stabilize it, at least temporarily." He gestured for you to sit and began to work, his hands moving with practiced ease. As he worked, he asked you questions about the device, where it came from, how it worked. You answered as best you could, careful not to reveal too much. The last thing you needed was to alter history by introducing advanced technology to the Renaissance. Leonardo listened intently, his eyes lighting up with curiosity. "This mechanism," he said, pointing to a small, intricate gear in the device, "is the key to its function, but it's misaligned. I can adjust it, but it won't be perfect." You nodded, grateful for his help. As he worked, you glanced around the workshop. It was cluttered but organized, with shelves filled with tools, gears, and half-finished inventions. A small window let in a beam of sunlight, illuminating the dust motes that floated in the air. "You have a remarkable mind," you said, watching him work. "How did you learn to build such things?" Leonardo smiled. "I've always been curious. The world is full of mysteries, and I want to understand them all." You felt a pang of guilt. Here was a man who could have changed the course of history with his brilliance, but his work would be lost to time. You wished you could tell him about the future, about all the wonders that awaited humanity. But you knew you couldn't. The professor's warning echoed in your mind. Observe, but do not interfere. Finally, Leonardo handed the temporal anchor back to you. "It should hold for now," he said, "but you'll need to find a more permanent solution." You thanked him and stepped outside. The air was warm, and the sun was beginning to set. You pressed the button on the temporal anchor, hoping it would take you closer to the present. With a flash of light, you were gone again. Chapter 4. The Final Stop. You opened your eyes to find yourself in a familiar place, the professor's workshop. But something was wrong. The room was dark and silent, and the time machine was covered in dust. The professor was nowhere to be seen. You checked the temporal anchor. The symbols were spinning wildly again, and the device was growing hotter by the second. You realized with a sinking feeling that you hadn't returned to your own time. You were in the future, a future where the professor was gone and the time machine had been abandoned. You sat down, feeling overwhelmed. How were you supposed to get back? The temporal anchor was failing, and you had no idea how to fix it. But as you sat there, you noticed something on the workbench. A notebook. It was the professor's, filled with sketches and notes about time travel. You flipped through the pages, searching for anything that could help you. And then you found it. A diagram of the temporal anchor with detailed instructions on how to repair it. You set to work, following the professor's notes carefully. It took hours, but finally the device was fixed. The symbols on its face glowed steadily, and it felt cool in your hand. You pressed the button, and with a final flash of light, you were back in the present. When you opened your eyes, the workshop was just as you remembered it. Bright, bustling, and filled with the hum of the time machine. The professor was there, tinkering with a new device. He looked up as you appeared and grinned. "Ah, there you are. How is the Magna Carta?" You stared at him for a moment, then laughed. "It was eventful." He raised an eyebrow, but didn't press for details. "Well, you're back now, and that's what matters." You nodded, feeling a deep sense of relief. You were home. And though your journey had been chaotic, you knew one thing for certain. You were ready for whatever time, and the professor threw at you next. Epilogue: The next adventure. The workshop was quiet. The hum of the time machine, a soft, comforting background noise. You sat at the workbench, the temporal anchor in your hands. Its symbols glowed steadily, a reminder of the journey you had just completed. The professor was across the room, tinkering with a new device, a sleek silver contraption that looked like a cross between a compass and a pocket watch. "What's that?" you asked, curiosity piqued. The professor looked up, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "Ah, this is something special. A temporal beacon, if you will. It's designed to detect anomalies in time, ripples, disturbances, that sort of thing." You raised an eyebrow. "Anomalies? Like what?" He grinned, "Like the one we're about to investigate." You felt a thrill of anticipation. After everything you had been through, the mishap with the temporal anchor, the journey through ancient Rome and the Renaissance, the abandoned workshop in the future, you were ready for a new adventure. But you couldn't help feeling a twinge of apprehension. Time travel was unpredictable, and you had learned the hard way that even the best laid plans could go awry. "What kind of anomaly are we talking about?" you asked. The professor's grin widened. "A big one. Something that could change the course of history if we don't intervene." You felt a chill run down your spine. Intervene? We were supposed to observe, not interfere. He nodded. "Normally, yes, but this is different. This is a threat to the very fabric of time itself." You swallowed hard. "What kind of threat?" The professor's expression grew serious. A rogue time traveler, someone who's been jumping through history, altering events, and leaving chaos in their wake. If we don't stop them, the consequences could be catastrophic. You felt a surge of determination. Then let's stop them. The professor smiled. That's the spirit. But first, we need to prepare. This won't be like our usual missions. This will be dangerous. You nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. Dangerous or not, you were ready. You had faced challenges before, and you had come out stronger for it. This was just the next step in your journey, a journey that had only just begun. The next few days were a blur of activity. The professor worked tirelessly, fine-tuning the temporal beacon and preparing the time machine for the mission. You helped where you could, but mostly you watched and learned. The professor was a master of his craft, and every moment with him was a lesson in the art of time travel. Finally, the day arrived. The time machine hummed with energy, its crystals glowing brightly. The professor stood at the controls, his expression focused and determined. You stood beside him, the temporal beacon in your hand. Ready? He asked. You nodded. Ready. He pulled the lever, and the world around you dissolved into a blur of light and sound. When the light faded, you found yourself standing in a bustling city square. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the clatter of horse-drawn carriages. The buildings around you were grand and ornate, their facades adorned with intricate carvings and frescoes. You checked the temporal beacon. Its symbols glowed steadily, pointing you in the direction of the anomaly. You and the professor exchanged a glance and set off, weaving through the crowd. As you walked, you couldn't help but marvel at the city around you. It was unlike anything you had ever seen. A vibrant, bustling metropolis, filled with life and energy. But beneath the surface, you could feel the tension, the sense that something was wrong. The temporal beacon led you to a grand cathedral, its spires reaching toward the sky. You and the professor entered. The cool, dim interior, a stark contrast to the bright, bustling square outside. The beacon's symbols glowed brighter, leading you deeper into the cathedral. Finally, you reached a small, hidden chamber. Inside, you found a man who looked eerily familiar. He was bent over a strange device. His hands moved deftly over its surface. He looked up as you entered, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Ah, Professor Thorne," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "I've been expecting you." The professor's expression hardened. "Who are you? And what do you think you're doing?" The man smiled. "I'm just a traveler like you. But unlike you, I'm not afraid to make changes, to shape history as I see fit." You felt a chill run down your spine. This was the rogue time traveler, the threat to the fabric of time itself. And he was more dangerous than you had imagined. The professor stepped forward, his voice firm. "You can't do this. You'll destroy everything." The man laughed. "Destroy? No, my dear professor. I'm not destroying anything. I'm improving it, making it better." You felt a surge of anger. You can't just change history. It's not yours to control. The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard expression. And who are you to stop me? You stepped forward, the temporal beacon in your hand. I'm the time traveler's apprentice, and I'm not going to let you get away with this. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the room was filled with tension. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he activated the device, and the world around you dissolved into chaos. Thank you for joining me tonight. And if you'd like to hear the next chapter in this series, please remember to subscribe.